Today I have another response to a request that we've received on our website, and this is to take the inputs for an indicator from a file. So the technique is the same for an indicator or an expert, but I'll be demonstrating this for an indicator today. You may want to do this because you're getting the inputs from some other source that's writing data to a file, or it might be that you're running an expert advisor on a VPS and you don't want to actually log into the VPS and modify directly on screen. You want to change the inputs remotely through something like a file on Google Drive. This video is for MetaTrader 4. There is a separate video for MetaTrader 5, and I'll leave a link in the description and on screen for the MetaTrader 5 video. For this video, I'm going to be using a very simple indicator, a Donchian channel. I'm using the Donchian channel because it involves no technical indicators. It's simply the high and low of recent bars. First, I'll write the Donchian indicator, and then I'll modify that to take the inputs from a file and explain some of the things you need to consider in making that change. So I have MetaTrader 4 open here. I'm just going to click this icon to open the editor. And now with the editor open, I'm going to go to indicators because I'm writing this as an indicator. I already have a folder here called Orchard. I'm just going to create a subfolder under that for my Donchian channel. So new folder. Donchian channel, and then I'm going to create a new file here. Custom indicator. I'm actually going to add the plots here in the wizard, so I have two. A Donchian channel has a high and a low. And that gives me the beginnings of the indicator. We can see here it's inserted the copyright, the linked version, and indicator chart window because the Donchian draws on the main chart, and there are two buffers, the high buffer and the low buffer. I'm just going to change these colors. I could have set them in the wizard, but I didn't, so I'm just going to change them now. I'm going to make this top line white, and I'm going to make it dot. I'm going to do the same for the bottom line, also a dot. And I'm going to make that blue. Just add a little bit of spacing. Now for a Donchian channel, I need a single input, and that's the number of bars to calculate the high and the low. So I'm just going to default this to 10 bars. So I have input int INP Donchian bars equals 10. That will default the input to 10, and this will appear as the prompt on screen for that input. The wizard has already inserted this set index buffer 0 high buffer, and it's created a double high buffer. So this high buffer array will store the values for the high side of the Donchian channel, and this low buffer array will store the values for the low side. And they were created by the wizard because I specified that my two indicators were high and low, or that my two channels were high and low. And it's also created these lines, set index buffer 0 high buffer. So index number 0 will be matched to the high buffer, and index number 1 will be matched to the low buffer. Now if we go to the on calculate, I'll just remove a couple of lines here. When this runs the first time, I actually want to calculate the Donchian channel as far back as I have bars on the screen, and after that I only want to calculate for the bars that have changed. So I'm going to insert some lines, you'll see these quite often, that calculate how many bars I need to recalculate. So I'm going to be using this variable count. So I've declared an integer count, and that tells me how many bars I have to calculate in this cycle through the onCalculate function. The onCalculate is called every time there's an update on the chart, and this count is initially rates total minus prev calculated. So these two are passed in. Rates total is the total number of bars available on the screen. Prev calculated is set to a value based on the number of bars that I calculated in the previous round. And if we just scroll to the end here, the end of this function is return rates total. That value, whatever I return here, comes back in prev calculated the next time on calculate is called. So if I have 100 bars the first time, I return 100, and the next time in, prev calculated will be 100. So I'm first setting count equal to rates total minus prev calculated. If no new bars have been created since the last time, that's obviously going to be 0. So I have this line as well, if prev calculated is greater than 0. So the first time I run the indicator, prev calculated is 0. But every time after that, it's greater than 0 because it is whatever the result was from here. And so I can simply say, if that's true, then I must be in another round, and I'm adding 1 to the count. And so the purpose of this is to force recalculation of that last bar on the screen, because that could be based on the current price, and in the case of a Donchian channel it is. So I want to make sure I recalculate that last bar on the screen. And then I have one more line here, if count is greater than rates total. Just in case something goes wrong, I don't want to get an error because I'm trying to access rates that I don't have. So if count is greater than rates total, then count equals rates total. That's just a safety line. And now the calculation for Donchian channels is very simple. I already have this value for count, so that tells me how many bars I'm looking at. So I have a loop here for int I equals count minus 1. So if I'm looking at 10 bars in total, I want to begin at bar number 9 because the bars are indexed from 0. So for I equals count minus 1, while I is greater than or equal to 0, I minus minus. So I'm counting back towards bar number 0, and bar number 0 is the currently open bar on screen. And then I'm calculating here the high buffer element I, and because I've declared these as buffers, I'll just take a moment to explain this. Because I've used this set index buffer and assigned an array to that buffer, that array is always sized to have enough places to match the number of bars on the screen. So I don't need to worry about resizing this or creating new elements as a new bar forms. That's done automatically for me. So I simply need to assign values to this high buffer I equals, and then this formula, I high, passing in the symbol from the chart, the current chart period, and the I highest, which gives me a bar number. That will give me the high value for this bar number. Let me scroll across a little bit. The I highest function finds the highest bar, or the highest priced bar, for the given symbol and period, and symbol bracket bracket and period bracket bracket both get the symbol and the period from the current chart. Mode high, I'm looking at the high prices on those bars. For the number of bars specified in INP Donchian bars, the input that we had above, beginning with bar number I. So I highest simply returns a bar number. And then I pass that bar number into the I high function. Go back a little. And that gives me the high price from that bar. And this way I'm setting the value of high buffer for bar number I to the highest value in the most recent INP Donchian bars. And then I do exactly the same for the low buffer, but in this case I'm using I low because I want to get the low price. Still using symbol, period, and I'm using the I lowest function, which is the opposite to I highest. It finds the lowest priced bar number given the symbol, period, looking at mode low, looking at the low price for the number of bars beginning with bar number I. Now it doesn't matter where I have this start point, the value returned by I lowest and I highest is the absolute bar number. It is not relative to this starting point. And once I have that, I finish and move on, and then I return rates total, which, as I said, comes in as the number of prev calculated the next time this function is called. And that's a complete Donchian channel indicator. Let me compile that. No errors. If I go back to my chart, I'll just shrink that down a little. Find indicators, orchard, Donchian channel, and here is my Donchian channel. I'll leave my inputs at 10 bars. And there you can see I have the white dotted line above and the blue dotted line below, which matches the highest price for the most recent 10 bars and the lowest price for the most recent 10 bars. If I change that input, we go to indicators, I'll just make that 30, and you can see the change there. So that's the simple Donchian indicator. Now I'm going to modify that so that I can take inputs from a file. Now I'm back in the editor, and you can see here I've opened up files and I have a folder called Orchard, and in here I've put a file called donchianinputs.ini. I'll just open that up. This is the file that I'm going to be using to feed information. So you can see Donchian bars, that matches with the one input that we already have, but I've also added this high label and low label. If we go back to the code, you can see that there's a label, indicator label 1 high, indicator label 2 low. Now they are at the moment properties, but I'm going to feed those in through the file as well, just so that you can see how different types of data can be fed in. Obviously the Donchian bars is an integer, but these two are strings. So I just want to show how they would be handled. These are not necessarily useful things to feed in, but I'm just going to do that as an example. And now the important thing to consider if you're going to accept input from a file is, do you still accept input from these input statements? I'm going to be feeding in Donchian bars from a file, but I also have an input statement here for Donchian bars. If the value from the file is different to this value, then which one should be used? That's not an answer that I can just give you. I'm going to take a particular approach. You need to decide what you're going to do. And my approach is going to be that I'll add another input here with the name of the file. If that name of the file is an empty string, then I'll use these inputs. If it's not an empty string, then I'll read values from the file, and any values that don't exist in the file, I'll be taking from the inputs. So there's my input INP settings file equals orchard donchianinputs.ini. This file could be called almost anything that you like, but by default, MetaTrader will only allow you to read files that are inside this files folder. So if you want to read a file from somewhere else on your disk, you'll need to use Windows APIs. So I recommend keeping the files inside here, and then you'll be able to follow the method that I have outlined in this video. Now, because I'm going to allow this file to override this Donchian bars, I can't simply use INP Donchian bars throughout the code. What I'm going to do is set up another variable, and I'll put the value from this input into that variable, and then that variable itself can be modified if something comes from this settings file. Now I've only got one input for this indicator, but obviously if I had more inputs and I were going to allow them to be fed in from the settings file, then I would do the same thing and create a variable for each of those. And now I need to put that input value into this Donchian bars variable. And I'll just do that in the onInit function, Donchian bars equals INP Donchian bars. And then any place that I've already used INP Donchian bars, I'm now going to just use Donchian bars. So let me do a replace on that. So I'll replace it in the high buffer and in the low buffer, and that should be it. Now so far I haven't done anything about reading values from the file. Down here in the onCalculate function, I'm going to add this statement. So I'm going to write a function called loadFile, and that will read the values from that ini file. It's also going to return a Boolean, and that Boolean will be true if I've loaded something that means that I need to recalculate all of the indicator. And in that case, all I do is set count equal to rates total, and that means when I go into this loop, which we saw earlier, then I will recalculate every bar on the indicator. If loadFile returns false, then it means either nothing changed or anything that changed doesn't need the indicator to be recalculated. Now I've chosen to run this every time onCalculate is called. You might, for performance reasons, prefer to test if there's a new bar and only load that occasionally, but at the moment I'm going to load this every time onCalculate is called. There is code inside the loadFile function to minimize the load that creates on your computer. But if you really don't want to try that as often as this, then simply put in a test here to see if the bar number has changed. And the other thing you need to do is put a call to that load file here after this Donchian bars or after any of these inputs are captured to these variables. And that's because if you simply restart MetaTrader and indicators or experts are already on screen, they'll restart and they will pick up the values from the inputs as they were last set. Now, if values in the file are different to those inputs, I need to make sure I load them here before any other processing happens in the indicator or expert. So I've got that one call just here as well. Now those are all the changes that I need to make inside the body of the code here. Now I'll get on to writing this load file function. So first I'm creating this Boolean result and I'm initializing that to false. And this is the value that's going to be returned from load file to indicate here if I need to recalculate the entire indicator. Now I have two statements just to make sure I don't run this unnecessarily. If INP settings file is equal to an empty string, so if in the inputs you haven't entered a file name, then I'll simply return, I'm returning result. I could just as easily return false because nothing's happening here, but I'll keep it this way, and that way as I make further changes in the future if needed, then I know that this will be returning whatever the current value of result is. So if the INP settings file is an empty string, then nothing's going to be changed. I return result, and that means I don't need to recalculate everything. The second test is just to make sure you've given a valid file name. If not, file is exist, INP settings file, then I also just return result. Now, you may want to enter an error message here, so print that on the log somewhere so that people can see that the settings file name that was specified is invalid, but I'm just going to be returning at the moment. And next, I only want to load this file in if the file has changed since the last time I read the file. So first I declare this variable static long last mod date equals 0. Now, a static variable accepts this initialization value the first time this function is called, but every time after that the function is called, this variable last mod date will have the same value that it had when this function exited the time before. So I'm initializing it to 0, but after this first call, it will have whatever value was left in that last mod date. Then I'm capturing this long mod date equals file get integer, INP settings file, and the file modify date. So if you modify that file, this is going to come back with the date and time that the file was last modified, put that into mod date, and then I'll be able to tell that that mod date is different to the last mod date. And then in this statement, if mod date is equal to last mod date, I simply return result, which so far is still false, so I won't bother to read the file because the mod date hasn't changed. If it has changed, then I'm simply going to update last mod date there equal to mod date, so that next time we come through here, it will pass this test, and then I'll carry on with the rest of the code for loading the file. Now just some working values here. The ini file, if we look at this Donchian inputs.ini, it has a key equals and a value, and all these values are strings. That is a number, but I'll be loading it as a string and then converting to a number later. So I've declared variables key, string value, and then line, which will be the entire line that I'm reading, and then this string array parts that I'll be using to parse that line based on the equal sign. Now I need to open the file. Int handle, that gets me the handle to the file, equals file open, INP settings file, the name of the file, comma, and then the flags for opening the file. File share read, because I'm opening the file for reading in a shared mode, or a single line or, a single vertical line, not the double vertical line that you'd use in an if statement. This is the single vertical line, so it's creating a logical or, file text, so it's a text file, or file ANSI, that's an ANSI file. If that's successful, then I'll have a valid handle. If not, then I'll have an invalid handle. So I say if handle is equal to invalid handle, and here again you may want to print an error message, but I'm just going to be returning result from there. And if I have opened the file, I do file seek handle, 0, seek underscore set. Now this is probably not necessary, but I'm just making sure. This file seek will move the pointer inside the file. So handle is obviously the handle to the file. It moves the pointer to position 0, and then this last argument shows the relative method of moving that pointer, and seek set simply sets it to this value as an absolute position in the file. So I'm moving the pointer in the file to position 0. And now I'm going to read through each line in the file. While not file is ending handle, so file is ending will simply tell me if I'm at the end of the file. If I'm not at the end of the file, then I'm going to read a line. So that's line equals file read string handle, and that will read one line up to the carriage return line feed at the end of that line. Then I'm using string split on that line, parsing on the equal sign, and note these are single quotes around the equal sign. This is a char variable that you need to pass into this function, and single quotes will denote a char variable. If you use the double quotation mark, it would be a string. So a single quote equals single quote, comma parts, which is this array here, so it will put the parts of this parsed line into this parts variable. I'm just initializing key and s value because they may have been set to something the previous loop through here. I'm getting the size of the array, so size equals the array size parts, which if the ini file is correct, that should always be 2. But I like to be safe, so I'm just testing it. If the size is greater than 0, then the key equals parts 0, and if the size is greater than 1, then the string value is parts 1. Now you may simply want to say if the size is less than 2, then skip completely, but I've decided to do this. And then string to lower key. So here, it doesn't matter if Donchian bars has capitalization or not, if it's all caps or whatever mixed case you have. I'm going to be converting that to lowercase, because that way I know that if you've made mistakes in the file, as long as you've got all the right letters in the right sequence, then I can still test this value in the coming statements. And now I just have to evaluate whatever's come back in key and s value. Now the key is a string, so I can't use the switch statement, so I'm having to use if statements. Also, these values are all in lowercase because I have used string to lower here on the key, so I know that the key will be lowercase coming in. If you capitalized any of these values, then this match statement would fail, so remember to keep these as lowercase. I'll go to these second two first. If key is equal to high label or low label, then I'm simply calling set index label, buffer number 0 for the high label and buffer number 1 for the low label, and I'm setting that to the s value. So they're simple enough statements. And because each line that I read can only have one key and value, I'm using these else statements. So the first time it passes one of these statements is the only statement that will be executed, and then it will simply loop around and read the next line in the file. This line though, if key equals Donchian bars. If Donchian bars changes, then I need to recalculate the entire indicator. So I've got this statement result or equals set value. Now or equals is the same as saying result equals result or set value. The set value function, which we'll write in a moment, takes this value, which is converting that string value to an integer. I'm casting it to int and using string to integer on the s value, and I'm passing that in, and if this value is different to this value passed in, then this set value function will reassign here and return true. So if the new value from the file is different to the existing Donchian bars, then result will be set to true, and that will be returned at the end of this function, which will cause the entire indicator to rewrite. When I exit this while statement, it means I've reached the end of the file, so I simply call file close for that handle and then return the result. So now let's look at the set value function. And here I'm using templating because at the moment I only have this one value, which is an integer, but in another indicator or expert you may have doubles, date times, any number of different types of value. The template statement, as it's written here, template, left angle bracket, type name T, right angle bracket, says that I don't know exactly which type this is going to be, but anywhere that I've used T inside the function, it is the type of the variables that were passed in here. So you can see I've used T there and T there. And because I'm calling this function with two integers passed in, it causes the function to set T to an int. And then what I have is bool set value int current value int new value. And current value here has an ampersand, so it's being passed in by reference, which means that this function can change the value of current value, and that changed value will be returned to the calling function. So then I do this comparison. If current value is not equal to new value, then I simply set current value equal to new value and return true. And if not, then I return false and current value hasn't changed. So this will only return true if these two values are different. And that should be everything. Let me just check the compile. That's correct. Now, I will keep this open and I'll bring up MetaTrader at the same time. Let me close this to create more space. The default is 10. I'll just leave that at 10 to begin with. So now I've placed the two windows side by side. I have the Donchian inputs.ini file here showing the values, and I've removed the indicator from the chart so far. I'm going to drag it back onto the chart. And here I have my file name. And because I have Donchian bars here the same, this has loaded up the Donchian channel with a value of 10 for the bars. Let me change that to something like 3 and then save that file. And as soon as there's another tick and we go through the onCalculate function, you see that the upper and lower have changed to a Donchian level of 3. Just change that again to 30 and save, and you can see another change here. So it's reading that file as soon as the next onCalculate is called. I've also set up the data window here, so you can see I've got upper and lower as the values for the high and low, and that's coming from here. If I just change this high label to high, change it to anything I like, and then you see it's also changed here. I have to move the mouse over the screen in MetaTrader 4. It won't simply refresh this without some kind of activity on the screen, but that's not really a critical issue. It has loaded the values, it simply hasn't updated this display. So changes I make here are being reflected as soon as I make them in the file. As I said, you may prefer to delay this until there's a new bar created. It just depends what kind of information you're putting into that file. And as I've also shown, I'm not restricted to only having values in here that are part of the inputs to the indicator, because the high label and low label are not inputs to the indicator, only the Donchian bars. And just remember that if you're going to change something like the Donchian bars that will affect the indicator overall, you need to do something to cause that indicator to be completely redrawn. And that's all for this video on reading files for the inputs to indicators and expert advisors for MetaTrader 4. Remember to hit that like button and remember to subscribe and click the bell icon so you'll be notified when we release more videos. Thank you for watching.